Bernie just tweeted his support for unions and collective bargaining in the video game industry. When you look at the problems that they're dealing with in the gaming industry, it is shocking, and it's clear that unions, as well as legislation from Congress, would help make these workers' lives better. Compared to average workers in the US, the salary for someone who works on developing a video game can be higher than most. That combined with the fact that most people consider working in the video game industry a dream job, the living conditions of video game developers aren't really a top priority for a lot of politically active people because at a glance, they appear to be doing a lot better than everyone else. But the reality is, it's not unusual for them to work 100 hours a week to finish a game by the deadline. It was a story a little while ago when a producer for the game Red Dead Redemption 2 was bragging about having staff working on the game 100 hours a week to finish by the given deadline. As if being a modern day slave driver was somewhat of an accomplishment. On top of that, the average salary for a video game developer with 2 years experience is about $50,000 a year. When you keep in mind that 50% of households in the US with two parents make about $30,000 a year, $50,000 a year for a game developer sounds like a good salary. But I just told you it's not uncommon for these people to work 100-hour weeks with no extra pay. So for that $50K, you'd basically be working almost 3 full-time jobs. A full-time job in the US is considered a 40-hour work week. So 2 full-time jobs and you're working at 80 hours a week. And then you add in 20 more hours on top of that. Imagine you, yourself, imagine how exhausted you feel after working a 40, 50-hour work week. And then imagine you having to work twice that. That's outrageous. At that point, these video game developers have dedicated every waking moment of their life to their job, and that's not an exaggeration. There is no way $50,000 a year is adequate compensation for having someone work every waking moment of their life for an entire year. Because the level of stress that you're dealing with, the complete lack of a social life or any type of family life or romantic life, no time for hobbies or anything you enjoy, the physical and mental health problems that will inevitably lead to, $50,000 a year does not cover that. But it's even more insidious. The projects that these developers are working on will turn around and make billions of dollars in profit for these same corporations. So the work that they spent every waking moment over the past year producing will make billions of dollars in profit for years to come. But the only compensation that they'll get from their employer is the measly $50,000. So these are some of the problems and exploitations that are rampant in the video game industry. But like I said earlier, the fact that at face value, this appears to be a dream job with relatively high compensation, rights for workers in the gaming industry is nowhere near top priority for a lot of people in the country, which puts them in a gray zone that highlights the importance of unions. If the federal government went industry by industry to find exactly what kind of exploitation each specific group of employees need protection from, and then put it into law, would take an extraordinary amount of time and effort and devotion from Congress to the issue of workers' rights that we've just never seen before in the US. That doesn't mean they shouldn't have any role in coming up with basic regulations to protect all workers in the country, because that is their job as the government. But it's been over 10 years since the minimum wage was last raised. That is the most basic of basic workers' rights you can think of. Paying someone enough money to pay their bills. That's the whole purpose of a job. And it's been 10 years and the government still hasn't acted on it. And as a result, we have millions of wage slaves in this country, working poor people who work 40, 50 hours a week and they still can't pay their bills because they're not getting paid enough from their employers. The point I'm trying to make is there needs to be another avenue for workers to defend and expand their rights besides waiting for the federal government to step in on their behalf. Each industry has problems specific to that industry. So when workers unionize and use collective bargaining, It acts as an effective shortcut to get to whatever the goal is that they're fighting for, whether it's a living wage or it's paid time off or maternity leave, paternity leave, whatever it is, without having to wait for the federal government to intervene on their behalf. That unionization works great in countries like Norway and Sweden. The workers in each specific industry or whoever hold a specific job title use collective bargaining to force the corporations to address the concerns that these people have in that specific occupation or industry, or they're going to have to deal with a potential strike where all of those workers don't show up for work, which will make it impossible for that business to continue to operate. That's why in Norway and Sweden, even though there's no federal minimum wage law, every job in those countries pays a living wage. I believe the average wage in Norway is like, 21 US dollars an hour. So I personally believe that unions do a better job defending and expanding workers' rights than the government does. I believe that if we had several large unions in the United States, whether it's by industry or by job title, we would be in a lot better place. We wouldn't have to wait 10 years for the federal minimum wage to be raised to $15 an hour and tied to inflation, because years ago, workers would have threatened to go on strike, or they would have just gone on strike until employers decided to pay them a living wage. Workers would have flexed their muscle and threatened to bring the entire economy to a screeching halt unless the 1%, the owner class, the executives, pay their workers who are making them billions of dollars a living wage and proper compensation for their productivity. And I believe that decision would have been made fairly quickly from executives and in boardrooms, because if they had to choose between paying their workers $15 an hour and shutting down their business indefinitely, they're going to choose to pay their workers $15 an hour. Then there wouldn't be all we have to do is primary the corporate Democrats with progressives who actually believe in a living wage. And then once we have enough progressives in Congress, then we'll be able to force a committee to draft legislation. And then we can maybe get it voted out of committee and then taken up for a floor vote for the entire House. And then we will send it to the Senate, where we hopefully would have enough reasonable people to vote yes on legislation for a living wage, and then we'll send that to the president's desk, and hopefully we have a real progressive in the White House who will then sign the legislation for finally raising the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. You could skip all that shit, take a detour around all that shit, and go straight to the board, go straight to the executives, and give them the ultimatum. Hey, look, all of your workers are unionized, and if you don't pay them a living wage, your business will be closed by tomorrow. There's a good chance by the end of that negotiation, those workers would walk away with a $15 minimum wage. Instead of Republicans and Democrats dragging their feet on this issue for over a decade, wages have been stagnant in this country since the 1980s. Wages have not gone up since the 1980s. And now we have millions of people living as wage slaves because they aren't getting paid enough to pay their bills and keep up with the basic cost of living. And it isn't just wages either. Unions would be able to address a lot of the workers' rights issues that we have in this country. The fact that this is the only country in the world without maternity leave and paternity leave that's mandated by the federal government. Or how we're the only country in the modern world that doesn't mandate paid vacation for every worker. A lot of countries in Europe and in Asia, they have mandatory 2 weeks paid vacation, a month paid vacation. Some places, they have 2 months paid vacation every year for every worker in that country. Unions would also be able to address the insanely long work days and work weeks that we have here in the United States. When it comes to workers' rights, the United States is the worst out of all modern countries, and it's because there's been a systematic effort to destroy unions in this country, which then shifted all of the responsibility of defending and expanding workers' rights to the politicians. And the politicians have no intention of defending and expanding workers' rights because they got all their money from the executives, which is why they destroyed the unions in the first place. So I love how committed Bernie Sanders is to creating strong unions in this country. I think that's something that clearly sets him apart from the rest of the Democratic candidates on the issue of workers' rights, because saying that you support a $15 minimum wage is a no-brainer at this point. If you oppose the $15 minimum wage and you're in the Democratic Party, the base is going to tear you to shreds. So when all these different candidates come out and say, oh yeah, I support a $15 minimum wage now in 2019, that's easy, because it would be political suicide if you didn't. But Bernie one-ups all of them on this issue, because he's not just fighting for $15 minimum wage. He's fighting for unions. He's fighting for paid vacation. He's fighting for all of these workers' rights that I mentioned earlier, and he's putting that front and center in his campaign. And to further prove that no one else is even in his league on this issue, Bernie Sanders is the first and only presidential campaign in history to be fully unionized and to pay a living wage. Bernie has been leading this fight for at least 30, 40 years, and it's going to be incredibly clear who actually cares about workers' rights when Bernie Sanders is on that debate stage with all these other corporate tools like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and Beto O'Rourke and all these other people who don't give a shit about workers and the workers' rights. So Bernie and his support for unions is a huge plus for him in his campaign, and it's something that no one else, no Democrat or Republican, can touch him on that issue, because he is leagues above the rest.